Welcome to God, Sex, and You, a daily discipleship podcast on healthy sexuality. Here's your host, Purity Pastor, Dustin Daniels.
The prophet Isiah writes in Isaiah 43, verse 2, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you." Again, Isaiah writes in 26:3, "You keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts you." The psalmist writes in Psalm 32, verse 8, "I will instruct you and teach you in the way that you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you." Such reassuring words from Scripture as we engage in this messy conversation about homosexuality today. My guest is pastor and author Peter Hubbard, and we're discussing his book titled Love in the Light: The Gospel, the Homosexual, and the Church. Today's show is great. It really is a must listen for church leadership. So if you're a pastor, a minister, a priest, or some type of lay leader of any kind, this show is very, very important. On today's podcast, we'll discuss a couple things here. Number one, how fear and uncertainty dictate the topic of homosexuality for church leadership. Number two, we'll ask the question, why aren't our pastors trained? And number three, how does the church's silence on homosexuality push people away? Today's show is titled The Uncertainty of Church Leadership on Homosexuality. I love your quote here. You say, "How do we proclaim our faith courageously if our pastors refuse to do the same?" And you mentioned it at the very beginning of the show here, how you didn't want this silence, to be about this subject. So, why is the church being silent? Why is that such a bad thing on this subject of homosexuality?
Yeah, that's a question I couldn't figure out. At first, I assumed it was fear, that pastors were afraid to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
But after meeting with many, and actually surveying pastors, church leaders in a number of different regions of our country, I really don't think it's pure fear. It is more uncertainty. How do you respond? There may be a little fear in there because there is so much cultural intimidation that we don't want to get it wrong. But the primary driver I don't believe, is fear, because pastors talk about hard things all the time.
Sure, yeah.
But they have no problem talking about those hard things if they're confident that what they're saying is consistent with the heart of Christ, the truth of the Scriptures. They'll say it. And but in this area, because there hasn't been a lot of practical work done in applying the gospel to the doubts, the fears, the struggles, the temptations of same-sex attraction in the past, then I think it left a lot of church leaders uncertain, in light of the cultural intimidation as well. How do we talk about this in a way that's consistent with the Scriptures, but also really helpful to the strugglers? And I think there's been a ton of really good work done on this in the last 5 to 10 years.
That's interesting. So it's not so much fear, because you got a great point. Pastors talk about hard stuff all the time. So if it's uncertainty, then is it so much our training or our studying or our convictions on the subject then? Is it a lack of training for pastors or church leadership, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I think it is. It's both a lack of training and a lack of experience. Like you take someone like me, I've not experienced same-sex attraction. I didn't really understand the struggle, so it didn't come out. I've been pastoring the same church for now 26 years. It didn't, in the past, it didn't come out in applications. It didn't come out in illustrations. I found, as I mentioned in the book, our church is very candid about struggles. We have people coming off drugs and people with struggling marriages, people battling porn, and are ready to say, please pray for me, help me, in church and in our counseling ministries. But we had never, as of maybe 10 years ago, we had never once had anyone publicly say, pray for me, I struggle with same-sex attraction. And so that's when it began to occur to me, why is there transparency on so many other issues, but not on this? Because that can inadvertently send a message to SSA strugglers that you're a different kind of person, and whatever the gospel says to these other kinds of people, drug addicts, porn addicts, people whose marriages are in a mess or have rebellious kids, the gospel speaks to all of them, but it has nothing to say to you. You're a different kind of person. And in doing that, we end up actually pushing them toward the culture that is screaming, we have something to say to you. You're part of us. And that is not a message we want to send, because it's not true. And as church leaders gain an understanding, I'm noticing, especially over the last 3 to 5 years, an increase in pastors who are willing to, make specific application in a message or at the end of a message, or offer a class, or, invite people who are struggling to come for help. And that's really important.
And what I hear you saying, Peter, is that if the community inside our churches is not going to embrace and allow to embrace them and talk to them and love on them, then we're actually, because of our silence, we're going to push them out of the church community and into the worldly community, to where, like you said, they are ready and willing to embrace that. That's profound.
Definitely. And tragic. Even though you only have 3 or 4% of the general population that would define themselves as gay, many more have struggled at various levels, especially as our culture becomes more and more pornographic, and teenagers at a very malleable age are being, flooded online and movies and everything else with pornography. So you're talking about sexual identity and desire at a very plastic age, that can be sent in a variety of directions. And as neurologists have demonstrated, deep pathways of thought and addiction are formed very easily during those ages. So therefore, even if someone doesn't eventually define themselves as gay or lesbian, someone coming through that, and then even if they come to Christ and see victory, they're still left haunted with questions like, why was I attracted to that? Why did I do that? And if the church is never saying anything outside of that's good, that's bad, but never really helping people process the fact that we are broken beings and our capacity for sexual brokenness is almost infinite in its variations. I don't know that you can have almost infinite, but let's say pretty wide in the range. And it's interesting. It's like even the Puritans believed that any man, any woman in the right or wrong situation is capable of any sin. And it does seem like we're testing that theory in this day.
Our culture here recently has proved that anyone can be capable of sexual sin, hasn't it? There are dozens of people who are being accused of sexual misconduct. Too many to talk about or to list, actually, which is quite pathetic. And whether the allegations are true, well, time will tell. As I mentioned before, this show is essential, especially for church leadership. If you're a pastor, priest, or minister, are you uncertain of how to preach and teach on this topic of homosexuality? Is the uncertainty paralyzing you to where you can't move forward, even though the Lord is directing you to? Well, my encouragement to you, my friend, is to seek out those people and the resources to learn more and to get trained. There are plenty of resources on this topic of sexuality, and it is really it's your responsibility as a pastor, as a priest, a minister, a group leader, or a lay leader to get trained, that you learn how to teach and train the next generation. Listen to this. The psalmist writes in Psalm 71, verse 18, "Now that I'm old and gray, do not abandon me, O God. Let me proclaim your power to this new generation, your mighty miracles to all who would come after me." So yes, if you have questions, feel free to contact me through the website at dustindaniels.org. I would love the opportunity to come alongside of you and your church. And on Monday, we're going to continue our conversation on this subject of church leadership, and we'll discuss how critically important our words are to our friends living in the homosexual lifestyle with pastor and author Peter Hubbard. His book is titled, once again, Love into Light, the Gospel, the Homosexual, and the Church. Well, thank you for listening to God, Sex, and You. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at Purity Pastor, and you can visit the website if you've got questions or comments at dustindaniels.org. Jesus says that we are blessed when and if we are pure in heart. And the reason for that is because we're going to see God. We're going to see Him face to face. Walk worthy today, my friend, as you cling to Jesus. Happy Friday to you. I love you, and I look forward to our time again on Monday.